Hiya, and welcome to The Little Boy Lost and The Little Boy Found, the latest in our riveting series of YouTube videos about William Blake. I sounded sarcastic then, I think they are riveting. I hope you do too. Um, a little bit of an unusual pairing this week because actually we've got two songs of innocence to talk about. So maybe one of the things first that we might talk about is that slight unusualness. Usually Blake pairs his poems across innocence and experiences and shows some sort of development. But what does it mean here that we've got the little boy lost and the little boy found, which clearly are supposed to be a pair, um, but they're both songs of innocence? Well, part of it is that they belong to a bigger picture, don't they? Of the little boy lost, the little boy found, the little girl lost, the little girl found, our little boy lost, our little girl lost. So they are across the kind of the two collections, aren't they? So part of it is that these two poems are a pair, but they also form part of maybe a bigger picture that Blake is kind of exploring around childhood and innocence and stuff like that. But I suppose also one of the things to think about is that, like, what sort of development do we get between the little boy lost and the little boy found, given that we're not in the songs of experience? So it's not experience necessarily that changes things. So I think we'll have a look at that. So we've got the little boy lost in front of us here. Um, and both of these poems are really, really short, aren't they? And I just thought I would do what I normally do, which is we'll start by just looking at the poem and talking about what it's about, just reminding ourselves. We'll talk a little bit about AO2 as well and look at kind of the imagery that Blake's using and the methods that he's using. We'll talk about AO3 and AO5, and then we'll finish with kind of maybe a suggested question and some thoughts about how you might respond to that suggested question. So with the little boy lost, it's only two stanzas, isn't it? Really, obviously, what we've got here is a boy that is lost somewhere specific. He's lost in the mire, and I think we probably should start there. This is an unusual poem by Blake's standards, in the sense that the natural world is not what it's normally doing, in that it's not a place of refuge and safety, but actually it's a place of danger and loss. He does that less often, Blake, but that's what we've got here. And I think probably the first thing that we would talk about is the nature imagery in this poem being unpleasant and threatening, and that being unusual. So you've got dark, you've got wet, deep, you've got mire, and so you've got this place that's hostile, haven't you? And that hostile place is kind of thematically linked to the boy being lost, isn't it? So the father walking too fast for the boy so that the little boy is lost then fits thematically with the idea that the boy ends up in this kind of dark mire, which is physical but also, I guess, a state of being. It's also emotional, isn't it? That idea of being lost and lonely is being linked through that nature imagery to the mire and the wetness and the darkness and the unpleasantness and the uncomfortableness. I think with this poem, it's a little bit like The Sick Rose, in that Blake always really loves multivalence in his imagery, and I'll just explain that word. I guess multivalence is that idea of multiple meanings of the same word. So the word father is multivalent in this poem because it could refer to a literal biological father, couldn't it? Or it could refer to God the Father. And it matters, doesn't it, which one you choose, because this could be a poem about loss of faith if it's about God the Father, or it could be a poem about parenthood if it's about a physical father. The vapour at the end of this poem is multivalent as well, doesn't it? Does it mean the mist on the mire, literally, a kind of natural feature? Does the vapour mean the father and the relationship between the boy and the father, or does it mean the boy's belief in God, or does it even mean the boy's own little soul dying and going to heaven? Well, again, because that word vapor is multivalent, it's going to be up to you to choose the meaning of that, and it's going to radically affect your interpretation of the poem. Blake, as much as any other poet, loved that. He loves it in The Sick Rose, and he loves it in this poem as well, just to give you the simple seeing image that could have all of these potential meanings hidden within it. So that's probably also worth thinking about, like Blake's use of that kind of multivalent meaning. I wanted to kind of do a little bit of AO3 actually, which I don't think we did in the lesson last year, to think about, okay, but what if we pick a meaning there? And what if we think about the vapour? So I was looking at this. I think when you look at the artwork and you see the vapour that the little boy is chasing, and if you think about the idea of a mire being a kind of bog or a swamp or a marsh, I wonder if Blake might literally be referring to a kind of a folklore thing called a will-o'-the-wisp. I think will-o'-the-wisps are mentioned in The Tempest because they're kind of seen as these kind of atmospheric spirits. This is based on a real phenomenon to do with bioluminescence and chemical luminescence or chemiluminescence. So there are modern scientific explanations for will-o'-the-wisps and why kind of strange lights and flames seem to appear over bogs and swamps, and it's to do with the organic decay of the kind of the elements. But obviously, before anybody knew about elements or organic decay, people were seeing these like strange spirits and giving them names. So will-o'-the-wisp was this kind of elemental spirit, and the idea in folklore is that they are meant to reveal or conceal a path or a direction, and they were meant to be kind of misleading. They would lead you somewhere and then disappear, and then you would be lost. So it seems likely that this vapour or this thing that the boy is following is maybe this idea of a will-o'-the-wisp or a foolish flame that the boy is following. And I suppose, again, that might affect your interpretation. So what we've got, or like one solid interpretation of this poem, is that the boy is out walking with his father in the misty mires. He then mistakes his father for a will-o'-the-wisp because his father is too quiet and walking too fast, and he follows this will-o'-the-wisp instead and is led astray by this kind of elemental spirit, and then starts to cry because it then disappears and leaves him lost. I think you could still see that as metaphorical, couldn't you, about the idea of following something insubstantial or believing in something that doesn't end up being true. That idea that this could be a poem about following things that end up being misleading or untrue and trying to stay on the right path. So there's lots of ways of looking at The Little Boy Lost, even in those kind of 8 lines. And then as I mentioned at the beginning, what we then get is not a little boy found in the songs of experience, but the little boy found still within the songs of innocence, which, as I said, is a bit unusual. So there is a kind of ambiguous ending or happy ending or multivalent ending again. But I suppose what you've got, if we're following that will-o'-the-wisp thing, the boy gets lost in the first poem and then he's found in the second poem, as the titles suggest. He's found by God, who appears like his father in white. And again, you've got this idea of kind of who is this boy chasing after and who's he being saved by? He was chasing after the will-o'-the-wisp, this kind of like folkloric spirit of mischief, but he is being saved by a more substantial belief in God like his father. And then God reunites the boy with his kind of distraught mother, and that's the ending. So you could see it as a happy ending, couldn't you, at the end of that poem, if we're going to look at it in that way. Again, because of that multivalence, you could talk about this poem being about death, and we talked about that in class, didn't we? That like if the little boy's soul is the vapour that flows away, what we've got now is the little boy being taken to heaven, reunited with his mother, who has died. So there's a kind of bittersweet ending to that poem. And again, it all depends on how you choose to interpret the multivalent idea of the father and the vapour and the mire itself. Is that a real place rooted in reality, in which case it's about a boy who gets lost and then gets found again? or is this about a state of being, or is this a spiritual place, in which case you could be looking at a poem about the afterlife or about kind of faith. So those are our options for looking at the poem, I think. So we've done a little bit of kind of AO2, done a little bit of kind of AO3, thinking about the Will-o'-the-Wisp. I think it's probably worth at this point bringing in a couple of critics. And again, I thought about critics that we've seen in the booklet. So I've got Matt Simpson there. And I think this Matt Simpson quote might explain why we have this kind of pairing within the Songs of Innocence. So look at what Matt Simpson says. This is what he thinks about the Songs of Innocence and Blake's message. Innocence needs to be guided not by regulations but by wisdom and prophecy, and by protector figures: angels, fairies, stars, the moon, shepherds, fathers, mothers, nurses. And I think if you look at Matt Simpson's view of this, I suppose we've got this idea of innocence being led astray by a figure that ends up being insubstantial, this will-o'-the-wisp, this vapour, or being neglected by a father who walks too fast and doesn't speak. So in the first poem, you've got an example of what happens when innocence is not guided correctly. And what happens is the boy ends up in the mire crying, and in the mire could mean literally, or it could mean spiritually, or it could mean figuratively. So the first poem, if we look at Matt Simpson's simple way of looking at it there, which I think is really good, the first poem is about how innocence, this is what happens when innocence is not guided, either by a neglectful parent or by kind of false belief or mischievous belief or kind of, this will-o'-the-wisp type misleading character. And then in the second poem, it's still about innocence. The boy doesn't gain any experience like the chimney sweepers do or anything else. Here we just have in the second poem, The Little Boy Found, just a model of, okay, so what happens when innocence is guided? And I think God appearing like his father is really important. We'll get to that with the next critic. But I think here we've got a model of how the father should have been. The father should have been more godlike. The father should have kissed the boy and led the boy by the hand and brought the boy to another protector figure, which is the mother, who is kind of alone and weeping and kind of doesn't have the child to protect. So I think maybe we've got an explanation for that problem at the beginning of the video, where I said that, well, why doesn't this turn into a Song of Experience? I think what we've got here is quite a simple model of like Blake showing us this is what happens when innocence is not guided, and then this is what happens when innocence is guided. And if we look at it like that, it's quite a positive, simple poem, isn't it? Or a positive, simple pairing of poems. I think like we did with the tiger the previous week, or like Rebecca did, I wanted to think about how this might have like a profound impact on Blake's kind of religious kind of poetry. So I think these two poems are religious poetry, aren't they? And I thought C.M. Bauer says something interesting, and we'll just take ourselves through it. And I think the two poems might help here. For Blake, God and the imagination are one. That is, God is the creative and spiritual power in man, and apart from man, the idea of God has no meaning. If we just look at that first bit, this is Blake's radicalism again, because this is not Christian teaching. This is not kind of traditional Christian teaching, is it, where God is this kind of distant figure who we're supposed to fear. Blake's view is that like God is us, not just that God is in us, but that God is us and we are God, and God is that potential that man has, that creative and spiritual power that man has. There's kind of no such thing as God outside of man. We're using man in the old-fashioned kind of sexist, mildly sexist way, aren't we? But I'm not sure. Sammy, the lights just went off. I'm not sure what period C.M. Bauer comes from, but when he says man, he means humans, doesn't he? I don't mean to be dismissive of that kind of reflexive sexism. It has no place in the modern world, does it? When Blake speaks of the divine, it's with reference to this power and not to any external or independent Godhead. That's why God appeared like his Father in white. Blake wants us to think of this idea of God being there in the Father, or being the Father. So when his songs tell of God's love and care, which this one does, we must think of them as qualities which men themselves display, and in doing so realise their full divine nature. I think C.M. Bauer's point is really interesting, because that makes the two poems in some ways poems about parenthood, about what it means to be a father. And The Little Boy Lost says this is how not to be a father. This is how to be a father in the absence of God. You walk away from your child, you neglect them, and you don't speak to them, and you don't lead them like God would. And the second poem, The Little Boy Found, is like the father has realised, or kind of displayed his full divine nature by becoming the protector figure leading his child back to the distressed mother. So I think looking at the critics might help us solve that problem of multivalence, which sometimes is a problem, isn't it? Sometimes if there are so many interpretations of a poem, it's hard to know which one to go with. But I think that idea of like these poems are religious poems, but as always with Blake, they're about Blake's own interpretation of where God is and what God is. And I think Bauer is saying something again pretty fundamental about the really radical religion that Blake had, which was separate from kind of Christian, like the traditional Christian religion. The last thing that I'm going to do, because I'm a little bit aware of running over, I'm trying to keep these videos shorter, aren't I? And largely failing. I thought I'd pick another kind of quote and turn it into an exam style question, and I'm going to ask you to answer this question in the little recap that we do next Monday. So this video will hopefully help you to kind of do a good job of that. And I'll just very quickly recap some of the things that I've said which might help you answer this question. So Margaret Bottrell says this: Blake was essentially a religious poet. He constantly said so, and he expected to be believed. How far would you agree with this statement? How far do you agree that ultimately Blake is a religious poet? So let's look at the statement. In what way do The Little Boy Lost and Little Boy Found confirm or challenge Bottrell's view that Blake was essentially a religious poet? Well, I think as with all of these opinions, you can disagree with it if you want to. But I think it would be hard to disagree with that statement in relation to these two poems. So I think you'd use these two poems as a way of agreeing with Margaret Bottrell there, that like these two poems are religious poems. They're poems about God and they're poems about faith, aren't they? So this is a poem about the little boy losing God or losing faith, or losing the part of his father that is God. And then the second poem is about the refinding, is that a word? About the finding of that again. So these two poems, I think, do confirm Bottrell's idea that Blake was a religious poet. But I think we need to ask ourselves a more complicated question than that, which is, what does that phrase religious poet even mean? What has Blake got to say about religion? Well, I think if we take the idea of the will-o'-the-wisp or the vapour, we might say that like religion and belief can lead us astray. So we have to have the right religion and belief about following God. And I think you could also say that the first poem is about a father figure who fails to do his religious duty, who fails to embody God in himself. And the second poem is about the father regaining that. So the second poem might celebrate kind of Blake's view of God. So that phrase religious poet is worth thinking about. Religious poet does not mean Christian poet necessarily, or certainly not traditional Christian poem. And I think the other things that you'd say is that these two poems, if you want to take C.M. Bauer's view and concentrate on God appeared like his father in white, then these are religious poets that are not traditionally Christian poems, in the sense that they're not upholding Christian teaching. They're saying that God is only present in us, not that God is this external force that we need to pray to and fear and save us. So as always with his religious poetry, Blake's religious poetry does not mean poetry that upholds Christian doctrine. How might Barrow or Simpson help you explore this? Well, yeah, I've just mentioned that idea that, like, Simpson's idea is a really good one about how the Songs of Innocence ultimately work, which is that innocence needs guidance. Innocence needs care and nurture and guidance. So it's not about following rules and regulations. It's not about following things that lead you astray. It's about finding protector figures, and for adults, it's about being those protector figures to protect children. Bauer helps us because he helps us maybe see that these two poems are radical in their view, not traditional in terms of like Christian teaching. And if we want to talk about it from that point of view, Bauer helps us with that. What literary methods would you talk about? So I think you would talk about the unusual use of the nature imagery, the idea that the mire is this place of danger, and the imagery of the mire is being used to represent the boy's spiritual or emotional landscape. I think you'd talk about the difference between light and dark in the two poems, the dark versus the white in the second poem when things are better and the boy is found. And you might also talk about the contrast and contraries between the father in the first poem versus the God/father in the second poem. So you've got contraries, you've got light imagery, you've got nature imagery. You could talk about those things. And lastly, what contextual factors are important? I think you could talk about the will-o'-the-wisp, couldn't you? You could talk about how Blake is rooting this in kind of folkloric ideas of being led astray by insubstantial things. But I suppose you could also talk about Blake as a romantic. You could talk about like he's using the traditional romantic ideas of nature being important and powerful, but he's using it in an unusual way because nature is not being this kind of nature is not this kind of comforting place anymore, is it? It's a kind of unforgiving place, which is not, which also fits in with romanticism. And also then you could talk about Blake's criticism of Christian teaching as a contextual factor as well. So I'm looking at the time. I think it's about probably time to wrap up with those ones. Hopefully, two fairly simple poems, but as always with the simple poems, complicated ideas underneath them, and hopefully that video has helped. So as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. That's the wrong thing, isn't it? It should be that now, shouldn't it? Or that, or that. I don't know. That maybe.